So I'm going to call our introducers in a minute, and we're all very excited to have Lorin Stein here with us today, and we're all going to show that excitement as we welcome Lulu Ford and Annika Jade and Sophia King. Let's all be nice and loud and excited.
Lorin Stein is the editor of the Paris Review. Prior to his work at the Review, Stein did editorial work at Publishers Weekly, Might, and Farrar, Straus & Giroux, where, as senior editor, he worked with notable contemporary authors such as Lydia Davis, Dennis Johnson, Jeffrey Eugenides, and Jonathan Franzen. 3 of the works of fiction he masterfully edited, Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson, Fieldwork by Misha Berlinski, and Varieties of Disturbance by Lydia Davis received National Book Award nominations in the same year. Stein is known not only for his editorial work, but also for his work as a translator. In addition to editing a translation of Roberto Bolaño's The Third Reich, Stein translated The Mystery Gifts by Georges Bouillet and Auto Portrait by Edward Lebay, which was nominated for the Best Translated Book Award in 2013. When asked what it is like to work in translation, Stein replied that, "The great thing about translating is that you don't have to make stuff up. The bad thing is that you are always sacrificing some quality you love in the original text. A translation almost never improves on the original, at least it shouldn't. The best you can hope for is not to screw it up too badly."
In 2010, Stein took the helm as editor of the Paris Review, following George Plimpton and Philip Gorovitch in a more than 60-year tradition of extraordinary literary publishing. When asked in what direction he intended to lead the Paris Review in the digital age, Stein said, "The experience of an educated person is to be born into one world, and then by the time you leave it, for that world to be altered beyond what you would have imagined technologically and culturally." As a publication for engaged readers, Paris Review is a platform for new authors, new ideas, and new engagement with form. When asked about the first story he chose for the Paris Review, Stein said it was an astonishment, all sex and brains and feeling. A minute before I read the story, I had no idea such a thing existed.
The Review continues to publish provocative and cutting-edge fiction. Under the direction of Lorin Stein, the publication has released its archive of interviews to the public. This series, The Art of Fiction, has raised the standard of literary interviews and created a wealth of resources for working writers. This has spawned a map for the future of form and a history of its exploration, a place of engagement that, as Stein says, tries to take a piece of the night and plunk it down in the middle of the day. Stein has endeavored to create a magazine that is both contemporary and true to its traditions, publishing only fiction that astonishes him. Throughout his career, Stein has made a point to promote eclectic and aggressive work, stories that attack their subject head-on. Despite the state of the written word in the digital age, Stein maintains that good writing doesn't need help and can't be heard. Please join us in welcoming Lorin Stein.
Thank you. That was not just the nicest introduction I've ever had, but I've never had it done by 3 people at once. I'll put you all on the payroll. It's an honor to be here. I've walked past a million times and I've admired Pratt students from a distance, but I never, if my sister had known that someday I'd be talking to you, she would have treated me better. I'm going to talk quickly and then open it up to questions. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. And I don't know whether what I'm going to say to lead off will be of interest to you, but it'll be over soon. I'm going to talk about fiction mainly, but we can talk about poetry. I know some of you are studying poetry, and I imagine some of you are interested in writing nonfiction, which should be of interest to everyone anyway. And that stuff, there may be something in what I say that applies to those things, but we can bring them up in questions. Last night I was having dinner. I wandered into dinner with a guy I'd never met before, who's a Canadian magazine and newspaper publisher, a friend of a friend, who's now gone into digital publishing. And he politely was asking about what I do at the Review, and he asked how many submissions we get a year. And I said I didn't really know because they didn't all come to me, but I had the sense that it was in the order of thousands and thousands and thousands. you know, maybe almost 10,000. I wasn't sure. Maybe not that many, but. And he said, well, how many do you get that you could consider if you publish 20 short stories a year? Maybe a little more, maybe like 25 stories a year. And I said 100 off the top of my head, but then I woke up this morning and I was coming to talk to you, and I realized that that's not actually true. The number of stories that we get that we could publish is probably pretty close to about 25. Because we want to publish whatever we can. So, you guys, depending how deep you are already in the study and the vocation of writing, you will have been encouraged, I hope, a lot by your teachers and by the example of what you read. And what I'm going to say now, I'm going to tell you 3 reasons that a story isn't for me one of those 25. So this will be pure negativity. And the 3 reasons are, in my mind at least, related, though I don't know whether that's true in the world. And I want to say, especially since I've just been told that this is being videoed, I want to say that everything I'm about to say will be, if I'm lucky, if we're lucky, about 70% right. I'm already thinking, when I was just in the bathroom, I was thinking of exceptions to the things I'm about to tell you. So I'm aware that I'm only telling you this as a sort of rule of thumb, rules of thumb. So, what makes a short story boring to me, uninteresting to me, and will assume a certain level of competence, you know? One, and this is an argument, this is part of an argument that I had a lot with the editor-in-chief at Farrar Straus, my old company. He's a very, very close friend, and it's something that we found ourselves arguing about a lot. For reasons that I don't really understand, but that seem to me undeniable, it's become very hard to believe in narrators. I'm very skeptical about a narrator. Now, when I say a narrator, I mean typically someone telling a story in the first person, but it can even be someone telling a story in the third person. Every story implies a person talking, it seems to me. Sometimes in a book like Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, you'll have a narrator that looks like an omniscient narrator that knows lots of stuff, and the reader, and a problem isn't created for the reader about why that narrator knows those things, right? The scene opens and you're somewhere, and then another scene opens and you're somewhere else. The narrator can talk about the backstory of a character, or can put you in a scene with dialogue, and that's not expected to be problematic for you. But that same narrator will begin a paragraph with the words, "But and so anyway," which until then I'd never seen in print before. It's something that some of us say, "But so anyway," as a way of starting the next thought. But it implied a personal narrator, a narrator who was also a person, who happened to know whatever he or she needed to know. I think he sounds like a dude to me, the narrator of Infinite Jest. So, what is it to not believe in a narrator? A short story begins with somebody's need to say something. That's at least the stories that interest me. And let's just, for the moment, I'll restrict myself to first person. A lot of people have told me something I didn't notice, which is that we publish a lot of first person fiction in the review. It does tend to interest me right now. Not historically, but right now, I find myself interested in what kinds of first person stories get told, because you have to believe whether or not there's a speech situation, whether or not someone is, in the novel The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford, there's a narrator who, the first sentence of the book is, this is the saddest story I ever heard. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. And a guy tells a story about the breakup of his marriage and says, "Come sit with me by the fire." And the reader, there's an implied speech situation. But it's not usually like that. It's often more like, a story that we published in the review a little while ago, actually in this last issue, called A Dark and Winding Road. I don't know if any of you read that, by a writer who excites me a lot, who published 4 of her stories. Her name is Otessa Moshfegh, Moshfegh. And that's a story that's typical of a lot of stories that I like, where a narrator is telling a story about something that happened to him, but he doesn't really know the meaning of it, and tells the story to try to figure it out. This brings me to the second problem that I see that makes something not interesting to me, which is that I can tell that the author and the narrator want the same things. We did an interview, our first interview with a TV writer for our next issue, with Matthew Weiner, the guy who created Mad Men. And he was talking about how he doesn't like, in a lot of TV writing, someone comes in and says, "What's going on?" Or someone says, "You'll never believe what just happened to me." "What happened?" "Well, and then he said, and that's not how it happens. In real life, you run into the room, you want to tell someone something, and they're talking about something else. So what's fun is watching someone try to tell a story. In the same way, often when you're editing a novel, you'll say to a writer, "This is too spot on," or "This is too convenient." A character will say what he thinks. That's almost never useful. Dialogue never, you can't write a line of dialogue. Well, if you think about it, you'll never be able to write a line of dialogue. But when you look back at a successful line of dialogue, you'll see that it's never saying the thing that it's supposed to be saying. It's always saying something different. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to put it in quote marks. Dialogue is always betraying a desire to say something other than what is really being said. Dialogue is an example, but in general, the stories that interest me are stories where the narrator and the author are not obviously on the same page. So that's a confusing thing to say. They are obviously, literally on the same page. For example, here's an example of a story writer that changed the way I think about short stories. And in the last 3 years, I've had to think a lot about short stories. Before that, I mostly thought about novels. I read short stories sometimes, but now my real job is to think about short stories. And because of the generation that I am, one of the writers who really changed things for me as a grown-up was Roberto Bolaño. His short stories started coming out in Grand Street and then in the New Yorker. A Bolaño story often, well, I won't say something about a Bolaño story. I'll just tell you something about 2 things that happened to me in real life that made me think, that's like a Bolaño story, which is always a good way of figuring out what's special about a writer, a realist writer. When something happens to you in real life and you think, oh, that's like a Cheever story, then you start to know what makes a Cheever story a Cheever story. In the case of Bolaño, I was on a grand jury. You guys are too young, probably. Been on a grand jury? Anyone? You have. So a grand jury, it's very peculiar. Not all municipalities have them, but in New York they still have them. You sit for a month doing half days, and the prosecution brings case after case before you, and you don't hear from the defense. You sometimes, wow, do I have to wait? Go like this?
Yeah, shall we?
No idea.
This is because I wasn't unloading enough. So you hear case after case, sometimes 2 or 3 cases a day, and and the defendant can speak in his or her own defense, but the lawyer can't. So basically, all you're saying is whether there's a likelihood that the crime that the state says was committed was committed. So you can sort of tune out because you're expected to rubber stamp, and very rarely does the jury, sitting in a room very much like this, it's like this middle section. You go into the room, you vote, you come back out, give the prosecution what it wants. There was this one case where we were all sitting, I think there were 14 of us. Grand juries are bigger though, maybe 20 of us. And the victim, a translator came out. The translator had a nervous twitch, slight guy, very shy. very shy seeming, and a little older than I am maybe. And then the victim came out, and he was an even smaller guy, really small, very young. They didn't say this, but I got the sense that he might have been an undocumented immigrant. He was from Mexico, delivery boy. He'd been getting off of his shift at 5 in the morning at somewhere in Midtown. He'd gone back to Harlem where he lived, and he'd gone to use the payphone, and the lawyer asked the translator why he was using the payphone. He was calling his aunt, who had just had a kid back in Mexico at 5 in the morning, our time. And which is funny because I wonder what time it would have been in Mexico, but I'm wondering whether it was a different country, whether there was a time zone difference. Anyway, would that make sense? Anyway, I'm sorry. And the translator said, "Oh, you're a local. Congratulations," in Spanish. And when he was at the payphone, a woman came up to him and said, "What? Did she ask you something?" He nodded and was told yet again that he had to say "see." He couldn't just nod it, looking down at the floor. What did she ask? She asked if I wanted a girl. He went with this woman into the lobby of an apartment building, and he saw a guy in the lobby. And the guy followed the woman, and they were having an argument, and the woman told the man to leave them alone, but the guy came into the apartment. And then she told the delivery boy that she would get a girl, and he was for $20 or something. And he and the guy started talking, and the guy tried to sell him drugs, and he didn't have any money. This went on for 3 hours, and it became kind of clear that the man and the woman were in cahoots. And then a girl came, the girl who'd been promised. But then they locked him in one room and went and had another argument in the other room. And then the guy came out with a sword, and the translator said, "What is that, espada? What's the word in Spanish? Espada?" And he said, "Sí, un espada." And the translator told us again that it was a sword. And at that moment, and we were all sitting here trying to make sense of where the story was going, and at that moment I thought, this is very much like a Bologna story. The translator doesn't know where it's going. The victim is concentrating on all the wrong things. He's ashamed of the fact that he wanted a prostitute. He doesn't think it's anyone's business why he was calling Mexico. He doesn't find the sword funny. It wasn't funny, it was scary. And it turned out that his cell phone, that was one of the things stolen from him, didn't work. He carried it around as a watch to be cool. And I thought this is very much what the experience is of reading a Bologna story. The reader doesn't know what's going on, and neither does the narrator. But we all have the sense that that something is trying to be figured out in the telling. The other time that I had an experience like that was, have any of you been to a Quaker meeting? No? Quakers worship, you've been to a Quaker meeting. Quakers worship by sitting in silence typically for an hour, and if the Spirit moves you, if God moves you, you stand up and you give a message to the rest of the people sitting there. And I happened to be, for lack of anything better to do on a Sunday morning, I happened to be in a Quaker meeting, something I've done before. I went to Quaker school. And a guy told a long story about looking for a meeting house. Quakers often visit each other around the country. He went to a meeting house in the middle of the country. It wasn't where he thought it was. He drove somewhere else. He found the Quakers in the town. There was a compass, an ornamental compass on the coffee table. And I'm watching this guy in the grip of the most boring story I've ever heard. But with the details, he remembers a bumper sticker that he saw. And he talked the way Quakers, he was a Quaker elder, which means someone who's been active in the church for a long, long time. He spoke the way Quakers speak. They don't do what I do. They don't revise what they say. They stand and speak with, again, as in a grand jury situation, a completely captive audience. You have to remain silent. You listen. Whether you look at them or whether you look down, you just listen. You listen. Whether they're crazy, which often is the case in New York. And I felt that there were some of the same things going on that I found in Bologna stories. That's something I like in stories, and that's something very different. And you find it in Raymond Carver stories, and you find it in I was going to say Flannery O'Connor. There's an example of a writer who doesn't often use the first person, but her third person narrators seem to be at odds with her, with her designs on the story. You never look at a Flannery O'Connor line and think, well, that's convenient. You know, that never happens. The third thing, this is the most obvious thing, is that if you read the book reviews nowadays in the Times, you won't often, or if you read James Wood's reviews in the New Yorker, one thing that they never talk about in those reviews, and that they shouldn't talk about, is that it doesn't really make very much sense for very many people anymore to sit down and ever write prose. It doesn't make economic sense. And it doesn't, you can't expect a mass readership the way you could not very long ago, especially when we're talking about fiction. It's an odd thing to do. Now, if you told me that you were working on a pilot for a TV show, I wouldn't be especially curious about why you were doing it. I could think of lots of good reasons to do a thing like that. But if you were telling me that you were writing a novel or a short story, I'd be puzzled. And one thing that turns me off in a story is when I think the writer had much of a choice about it and chose to do it for the kinds of small rewards that kind of writing can produce nowadays. A certain kind of prestige, a certain kind of respect, a certain kind of laugh. No one's a saint. We all do things for that kind of reason. But when it shows up in the writing, it means that the characters aren't in charge. And we used to say at FSG that you could hear the tap of the keyboard at the Starbucks. Once I think of a Starbucks, the spell is broken. So I'll just leave it at that as a way of opening it up to questions. I know that what I've said probably is a little bit not very clear, but if it's interesting, we can hash it out in Q&A.
So you're speaking to a group of young writers who are trying to get their works out there and for people to read them. As an editor, what would your advice be to us approaching publishers and editors with our work, and just getting them to look at it and read it?
So sort of everything before what I just said. Right? Before you make it good, I'm teasing, but well, just send it to them. I mean, figure out, look at the books that you like, look at the acknowledgements page. You can figure out who edits what and who represents what, right? And find things that really speak to you, and then go online, do a little sleuthing, and get a direct email address if you can, and write a very short cover letter. No one cares about your background. No one cares whether you have a degree or not. You're starting off. There's a certain glory in discovering someone who's a kid and who doesn't have a lot of publications. So it won't hurt you. Keep it short. Make the thing really, really good.
I'm wondering, that feeling in a piece of prose, the tap of a keyboard at Starbucks, is that, you said that that's sort of feeling the author forcing, or sort of feeling the author's hand. Is that a kind of self-consciousness or a kind of insincerity that is communicated in prose, or what is that?
The question is, what makes that tippity-tap sound at the Starbucks that I was talking about, and is it insecurity or self-consciousness? I think it's the thing that I mean when I say it is a lack of something to say, a lack of a burning thing to say. when you sit down to write a story, you should do it for a very strong reason. The narrator needs a strong reason, and the author needs a strong reason. And the strong reason, you will come up with more strong reasons the more you read. The more you live and the more you read. It's one problem with going to a master's of fine arts program is that you'll be around, if you do that, you'll be around lots of people who are doing the exact same thing and care about the exact same thing that you care about. So as a result, editors like me get lots of stories about breakups in MFA programs. I mean, lots. It's up there with the death of a parent, because if you live long enough, your parents die, and it's sort of like sketches of the left hand. I mean, we've all got one, and it's there, and you can draw it, and it's kind of hard to draw, so people do it. And they do breakups in MFA programs. Now, the more you read, the more you live, the more different kinds of situation will be compelling to you. And without a compelling situation, there's nothing. A compelling situation and a strong angle on it, there's not much really to say, so that the reader hears other reasons for the piece to come into existence. If that makes sense.
So in your introduction to Butterfield 8, you wrote that O'Hara's advantage over other writers of his time was his tackiness. And I'm wondering how you think that translates to work that's being produced today, you know, and writing about, I don't know, technology, like what's tacky, what isn't, where's the line? What's tacky,
what's not? You've come to the right place. In the introduction that was referred to, it's an introduction to a novel by John O'Hara from the 30s, and I was saying that in certain moods I like O'Hara better than Hemingway, for example, and Fitzgerald, because even though O'Hara didn't get the kind of respect that they did, and looked up to both of them a lot, he was slightly younger, because he doesn't know what not to say. He'll talk a lot about brands, you know. He'll talk about you always know what kind of car the character is driving, which Hemingway or Fitzgerald would think was kind of tacky. O'Hara would be really explicit about sex and about race too, when that made it sound like and Jews and Gentiles at a moment when that stuff would have been not something for a polite writer to talk about, or not something for a cool writer to talk about. O'Hara always looked like he had a chip on his shoulder. Nowadays, I like tackiness, and I like tackiness in contemporary fiction. I would say that Ottessa Moshfegh, for example, is a writer who typically, in the 4 stories that we published, 3 of them involve a sexual encounter that, 2 of them really, but there are shades of this in the other 2. A sexual encounter that the narrator is trying to process and doesn't really understand. Sex is a great topic for writing when you really have something to think about. It's not a better topic than anything else, but in itself. But it's one of the places where fiction, compared to, for instance, nonfiction, has an edge, because when you write about intimate things in fiction, you can tell truths that we can't tell about people we actually know. And one obvious example to me is the novel Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, that's about the breakup of a marriage over many decades. And to me, there's a lot of truth in the book. There's a lot about breakups that's interesting and true that I didn't know before, that I wouldn't have thought of before I read it. And if Franzen had been writing about his wife, then we'd be dealing with someone who had no morals, and who had an agenda, and we wouldn't believe anything that he said the same way. So that kind of tackiness, I think, fiction lends itself to. Does that answer your question?
I saw in an interview that I read in interviews that you said that you can tell breastfeeding, and she says, and the baby looks up at me as if, with a shipwrecked look, as if my body was the island she washed up on. And like when I read that, I was like, wow, like that's amazing. But do you find that the first line is like easily the most important line in a piece, or what's the?
It's not that. I think if anyone who's been an editor for, it doesn't mean that we're right. It means that we know what kind of thing we like. If we started halfway through the story, we probably would also say the first sentence we read spoke to us or didn't. There is, because there's certain conventions about the first sentence, right? When you sit down to write something, the first sentence, is it going to be a line of dialogue? There are choices that you make that are specifically first sentence choices. And it's sort of like the opening of a chess game, in that well, no, not really, because the openings for chess games are pretty standardized, but so it's actually nothing like the opening of a chess game. But watching a writer struggle with the question of what to do with the first sentence tends to be a pretty revealing moment. There are other revealing moments, what to do with the last sentence, or what to do with the second sentence. Those are all ordeals, mini ordeals, so they're especially revealing. But in general, I think you pick up the sound of a voice. I think in Jenny Phil's, that's an excerpt actually from a novel. I think if I picked up the novel anywhere, I would have thought that it was a book that might interest me. That's a very believable narrator, by the way, for example. I don't mean that the narrator, that this is a novel that seems in many ways like it might be autobiographical. And the authors complained about that because a lot of it's make-believe, but part of what gives that feeling is that the narrator has a mind of her own and seems to be thinking her thoughts without much regard for the plot of the book, which is excellent. So you have a brilliantly plotted book where the plot is happening here, and the narrator is just talking in little tiny paragraphs with lots of white space between them about thoughts she's had, thoughts about astronauts, or about watching her kid nurse, boring thoughts, but true thoughts, and the story that they tell is really pretty exciting.
In the second thing you said about what makes a story boring, you were talking about the necessity of there being space between the author and the narrator. Do you find stories that are, obviously, or maybe not even obviously, that are told from the perspective of where the author is the narrator? Do you
mean
find
like
this to be
Marie
totally
Calloway,
disinteresting?
Yeah. The question is, if what interests me is there is a space between the author and narrator, does that mean that stories, the person who pops into my head when you say this, Marie Calloway, a writer who some of you may have read, who's a young writer who's gotten a lot of press for her stories, which are about someone named Marie Calloway, and involve, actually, speaking of tacky, that involve often, speaking of sex, sexual encounters. And you can draw a pretty straight line from the thing that she's talking about to something that actually happened in the world. Or Tao Lin might be another example of someone who seems that way. Not in and of itself, it doesn't matter how close the facts are between the author and the narrator, because the situation of telling the story is itself make-believe. Take another writer, Lydia Davis, for example. I won't talk about Calloway or Tao Lin because I name them because I bet they're writers some of you will have read, but I respect both of them. They're not writers I would turn to for fun necessarily, but I'm impressed by the integrity of what they're doing. They take it seriously, more seriously I think than critics always give them credit for. But to take another writer, Lydia Davis, who I do read for fun, a lot of the make-believe in a Lydia Davis story is not in the stuff she's talking about. It's in the narrator who is so typically overwhelmed that this narrator, usually a woman, though it's not said, it seems like a woman, is trying to organize her experiences. So for example, in a famous story called Break It Down, actually a male narrator, is remembering a weekend with a woman who's left him. And he's thinking about the money he spent on the weekend that they spent together, and the time that he spent with the woman, the number of times that they made love, the amount of time they spent talking, the time that they went to breakfast. And he's just trying to work out the cost. This weekend may have happened in some version, some way, but the make-believe is the narrator who would actually try to break down the cost of the time spent with the beloved. That's the fiction. And so that's why I think you can have a real one-to-one correspondence between something really autobiographical and still have a narrator who is not the author. Whereas in a crime novel, for example, it's completely made up. The narrator and author are often doing the exact same work. You know, you can tell from the moment the blonde walks in the detective's door. You see how much crime fiction I actually read. You know, everyone is working together to make the plot work. You always know what every line is for.
I'll ask a question, just take some time to review. But one of the other bullet points you mentioned about what makes a short story interesting, this idea that no one does really know what's going on, and there's a sense of trying to figure out what's going on through the narrative. And you mentioned Amy Carver, I forgot, and Roberto Bolaño, who I haven't read. So in contemporary fiction, how much room is there for actually figuring it out by the end, i.e. resolution? Do we get there? Can we not get there? Be taken seriously?
Well, if the question is how much room is there for resolution for a story that Lorin likes, I mean that I like, there's some kinds of resolution that are great, and you want a story that ends when it should end, and you want things. There's some, actually, The End of Freedom, this is a short story, but a novel. This is a novel that some people thought that the ending was really kitschy. The husband and wife, after infidelities and just mutual hatred, having gone for 30 years, they realize that they're old, life has left them, and they get back together. The wife is lying almost frozen to death, literally frozen to death on the doorstep. The husband picks her up, puts her in bed, they look in each other's eyes, and they see the horror of their life together, and they choose marriage. I finished it and put my head down on the desk with the manuscript, and I sobbed. Others thought that it was really cheesy. I think it's fun to have a cheesy ending. What I like is to go back, not to make her the only writer I talk about, the only young writer, but Tessa Moshfeq's story, Dark and Winding Road. I was talking to an editor in the fiction department of the New Yorker about this story, and we had completely different feelings about what the story was about. I thought it was about a man coming to terms with self-loathing and sexual confusion, coming to terms but not yet having realized that he's coming to terms with it. She thought it was a story about someone getting ready to have a kid, which is what how the story begins. And we both thought it must have something also to do with alcoholism. I thought that was a bigger deal than she did. But we both come up with very elaborate sets of feelings, and the fact that they didn't, and we were sort of surprised, and my friend Cressida said, that shows that it's a good story because it's an object in the world. You treat it as something that actually happened. That's something else that tends to happen with fiction that I like. I misfile it. I think that I'm remembering something that someone told me or that something happened to a friend of mine, and then I remember that it's a story. Does that answer your question?
I was just wondering, it sounds like the story that you told about the grand jury and watching the vulnerability and watching all the disconnect and all the different sort of ways that pain existed but missed each other is sounds a lot like how not wanting to ever know what a line is for, or how in crime fiction, if you always know what every line is for, it's really boring to read because the characters are safe.
Yeah.
So do you think that it's not knowing what a line is for is sort of creates an interesting story by making a lack of safety?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think that the question is, I guess another way of putting the question, tell me if I'm wrong, is this effect that I'm talking about where ambiguity is what we're really talking about, is created by lines that you don't know quite what they're for in the story. Now, there are writers where you really do. With Dickens, you tend to know what's going on from page to page. Dickens is one of my, it's ridiculous to say, he's one of my favorite novelists. He's everybody's favorite novelist, one of them. There's nothing, a lot of editors actually read Dickens when they're in the middle of a hard edit, I've found. Because you never, yes, they're boring passages, but you never really want to touch his copy, as we would say. You know, you never think, oh, it would be, the sentence would be better if this happened. You're just thinking, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. You tend to know what every line is for in Dickens.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Lorin.